Welcome to Infectious Conversations, the Infectious Diseases podcast recorded at WVU Medicine in Morgantown, West Virginia. And now your host, Dr. Meera Mehta.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Infectious Conversations. This is WVU Medicine's Infectious Diseases podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Meera Mehta. I'm a clinical infectious diseases pharmacist, and I've been practicing at Ruby Memorial for about 7 years. And today we have a great guest with us, Carissa Tedeschi. Carissa, thank you for being on this show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. So Carissa is our current infectious diseases resident, but she is wrapping up her training and she actually will be practicing at Mass Gen in Boston once she graduates. So we're really excited that you were able to train with us. Sad that you have to go, but we've definitely enjoyed your time being here and rotating with us.
Of course, I've enjoyed being here and I'll definitely keep in touch.
Definitely, that'll be awesome. So today we have a very relevant topic. I feel like the weather's changed. It's a lot hotter now. We're going to be heading into summer soon. And so we're going to start having cookouts and pasta salad and inviting friends over and having gatherings. And so today's topic, we really want to focus on foodborne illnesses because foodborne illnesses can make people very, very sick. So it's really important to be aware about it and to know what to do and what to look out for. I really have an embarrassing story. When I was a resident, this happened 2017, 2018. This was a big mistake, but I got a tuna fish sandwich from a gas station.
Oh, no.
And I was doing an 8-hour drive home. And needless to say, Christmas and my birthday was just me throwing up and being really, really sick. And then when my co-residents found out about it, they never let me forget that story. So moral of the story, no tuna fish sandwiches from gas stations. I'm actually vegetarian now, so don't have to worry about that. But Carissa, why don't we start off with you telling us what are foodborne illnesses and what happens to a person when they contract a foodborne illness?
Sure, that's a great question. So a foodborne illness is a type of sickness that you can get from eating food that's been infected with some type of pathogen. Sometimes we call it food poisoning. You might be more familiar with that term. And some symptoms that you might experience if you have food poisoning are things like diarrhea, stomach pain or cramps, nausea, vomiting, or fever. And they're really unpleasant for what you have to do to get food poisoning to what it presents like. It seems kind of out of proportion. It's really unpleasant.
Definitely, absolutely. Are there any foods that are more likely to cause food poisoning than others?
Sure, that's a great question. There are some foods that are more likely than others to be implicated in food poisoning, and they're things like eggs, meat, seafood, raw milk, and raw vegetables and fruit. And they can carry those harmful germs that can make you sick. But really any food can get contaminated, especially if it comes into contact with those foods. And that's why it's important to wash your hands after you've touched eggs or meat, or to use separate utensils and cutting boards for meat and foods that you aren't going to cook. So you wouldn't want to cut your vegetables up on the same cutting board that you've just cut up some chicken on, for example.
Right, that's a good point. You want to avoid as much cross-contamination as possible. Can you tell me about some current foodborne illnesses? I feel like we've already had some this year in 2024.
Sure. The one that comes to mind actually just recently got announced. There was a fresh basil had salmonella in it.
Wow.
And it just recently got announced. Doesn't look like West Virginia stores were impacted, but if you are listening to this podcast from somewhere else and you bought fresh basil recently, you might want to double check that you don't have any product that's been contaminated. But the CDC has a whole website about food safety. It's cdc.gov/food safety. That has a lot of the information that we're going to talk about in the podcast today, but also has a whole section on outbreaks and recalls. And you can see if anything that you've purchased might have been affected or and it tells you what you should do. Usually, almost always, it's throwing away the item.
Right.
But things that you should monitor
not
for.
eat.
Yeah, don't eat it. Rule number 1.
Yeah.
But also like how to wash down whatever it's touched and what you should be monitoring for and all that kind of thing.
And I'm sure likely it will have like batch numbers or manufacturer names as well. I
Yes,
remember
that's right.
around Christmas last year there was a salad. I think it was spinach actually that had a recall. And I remember being in the kitchen with my mum and I was like, was it this spinach or was it a different manufacturer? So yeah, definitely keeping track of which manufacturers or lot numbers or batch numbers too can be helpful. So those are some recent outbreaks. What about some historical outbreaks? Are there any famous outbreaks at all that you remember?
Yeah, so the first one I can really remember hearing about was E. coli in Jack in the Box hamburgers. That was in 1993.
Oh, wow.
So it was before I was born, but my parents lived out in the Washington area where it was kind of the epicenter of it.
Yeah.
So my parents actually never let me order a hamburger growing up at a restaurant. So I was a huge chicken nugget kid. They were very worried about ground meat, but a lot of people got sick and a few even died from that outbreak, especially like little kids, and I was a little kid at the time, so makes sense that they were so concerned. But it caused like a big national panic and it led to some changes in food handling regulations, so it's good that they learned from it, but very unfortunate that those people passed away due to it.
Yeah, it's definitely quite sad. So it seems like multiple different types of bacteria can cause these outbreaks. And I was actually looking into this. The most common bacteria, some of them, to name a few, there's Campylobacter. So this is the second most common cause of diarrhea in the US. Sources of Campylobacter include raw meat or undercooked meat, also raw milk and untreated water as well. Clostridium botulinum, this one is responsible for botulism that I'm sure people at home have heard of. But this organism can actually cause a toxin which causes botulism, which can be life-threatening. Sources of this organism can actually occur in these canned goods. So if canned goods aren't stored properly, or sometimes you might see they might have a dent or the can might be compromised, that is at high risk for having maybe a Clostridium organism. E. coli is one that I'm sure everybody has heard of. That can also cause a toxin, and sources of that can be meat, especially undercooked or raw meat, raw milk, and unpasteurized juice and cider as well. Listeria is another one that you may have heard of. So this one, again, is found in unpasteurized dairy products, especially soft cheeses, and sometimes in meats as well, and salads. And then salmonella. Salmonella is the most common cause of diarrhea in the United States, and it's the most common cause of foodborne deaths as well. But again, attributed to raw and undercooked eggs, undercooked poultry and meat, and then sometimes even it's found in fresh fruits and vegetables and dairy products as well. So those are kind of the most common organisms. But I thought it was quite interesting because when we look at the time to onset of symptoms, it can vary significantly from one organism to another. So when I had that gas station tuna fish sandwich, I was sick within a few hours. So some organisms like Campylobacter, E. coli, they take anywhere from 2 to 5 days to develop symptoms if you have those. Salmonella can be 6 hours to 6 days. And then listeria usually happens within 2 weeks. So sometimes that can happen a little bit later. So I just thought that was really interesting about the different organisms. It can affect you within a few hours or sometimes a few weeks as well.
Right. It's kind of scary that you could eat something like a week and a half ago.
You might
and
think you're all good. You know, you
Yeah.
had a great meal, you're doing fine, and then unfortunately
Surprise.
you might get sick. So let's talk about safety tips. I think prevention is key. How do we stop people from getting sick from foodborne illnesses?
Right. That's a great question, especially with all the scary things we've talked about. But a lot of it comes down to proper cooking and storage. So you shouldn't necessarily avoid eating these foods. A lot of them can be part of a healthy diet, although maybe not a gas station tuna fish sandwich. But, you know, vegetables and fruits and everything, healthy diet. But there's some things that you can do to decrease your risk of food poisoning. So You want to drink pasteurized milk. Washing and peeling your fruits and vegetables can help. Also, cooking your meat to the correct internal temperature. So if you've ever seen somebody use like one of those food thermometers, that's what they're doing, making sure it's cooked all the way through. And refrigerating your food quickly after cooking or cutting and peeling it. They say within 2 hours or within an hour of like cutting up vegetables, if they've been in like a hot car for a picnic or something, you want to make sure they get put into refrigeration quickly. So it's can be a challenge if you're out on a hike or something.
Right.
Definitely things to think about when you're packing your meals for that. And then it's not really a food safety tip per se, but if you're going to be traveling and you like to try out local restaurants and eat local food, and you're going maybe somewhere internationally or somewhere you haven't been before, getting a hepatitis A vaccine prior to going on those trips might be beneficial, because sometimes you can pick that up while you're traveling. And one of my friends got it on a cruise once, and she will never forget that. She was so sick.
That trip was probably memorable for the wrong reason, unfortunately. Well, those are all really, really great tips. What should someone do if they feel like they might have food poisoning?
Sure, great question. So it depends on what your symptoms are. A lot of the times, unfortunately, you just kind of have to make it through, ride it out. The symptoms are usually self-limiting, but you can do supportive care things like making sure you're drinking plenty of fluids so you don't get dehydrated, and resting and eating some bland foods until you feel like you can tolerate eating more. Those are the sort of general things you can do at home. But if you start to notice things like bloody diarrhea that lasts more than 3 days, if you have a fever over 102 degrees, if you're vomiting so much you can't keep liquids down, or the patient or the person feels dehydrated, like they feel dizzy when they get up, that type of thing, those are more serious signs, and you should be going to your doctor or urgent care or something like that.
Okay. And then are antibiotics needed with these illnesses?
Good question. It can be tricky. It depends on what's causing the food poisoning. And a lot of times we never really get to the bottom of exactly what it was, if the symptoms have resolved quickly or it's a non-severe case. And one of the top causes of food poisoning that's not a bacteria is norovirus. So antibiotics really won't help in that case. And that's just kind of supportive care. But if the patient is really having a severe illness, or it hasn't gone away after about a week, or if the patient is a higher risk person, so someone who's older than 65, younger than 5, pregnant, or otherwise immunocompromised, those can all be reasons that someone might go to the hospital or potentially get antibiotics for their illness.
Okay.
The doctor might order a stool sample and try and get to the bottom of what's causing this. But that's a good question, because not starting antibiotics when it's not indicated helps us to prevent the development of antimicrobial resistance, which I'm sure people have heard about in the news, and it's the kind of thing that keeps you and me and all the other ID specialists up at night worrying.
Absolutely.
And it also helps the patient save money, so they don't buy antibiotics that they don't really need. But antibiotics can have side effects too. They can impact your gut flora moving forward, so using them only when they're necessary is important, even though it can be tempting to throw them at the sickness, because supportive care is kind of a meh answer. Right.
Yeah, I think, again, prevention is key. So if we can prevent it, we don't even have to get to the treatment stage. Well, thank you so much, Carissa. We really, really appreciate you being on the show today. We learned a lot about foodborne illnesses. So thank you for your time. And thank you, listeners, for listening to today's podcast. I'm Dr. Mira Mehta. And you've also been listening to Dr. Carissa Tedeschi, and we hope you join in next time for our next episode of Infectious Conversations.